Hi there, I'm Dan. I'm a junior doctor, and if you're new here, I am currently taking a little bit of a break from clinical medicine in the NHS. I've been reflecting over my career, which has now been 5 years. In that time, I've worked in many different specialties across many different settings. Medicine has given me some unbelievable experiences, and there have been some really big challenges that I've had to overcome along the way. In this series of videos, I want to share some of those experiences, go back, relive them, and tell you how I felt and what I learned from them. So to start, I want to tell you about my very first year as a doctor. In the UK, when you qualify, you become a Foundation Year 1 doctor, or an F1. Initially, you have sort of a preliminary license or a provisional license to practice, and the idea is that you'll supervise throughout that year, and then after your F1, you get your full license to practice by the GMC. As it's part of your mandatory training, you do have to rotate through a number of jobs. Everyone goes through 6 jobs across the 2 years of Foundation Year 1 and Foundation Year 2. And you often will have to move hospitals, so doing F1 in one hospital and F2 in another. And the idea is that one of those hospitals should be big and one of those hospitals should be small. So I graduated from Nottingham in the summer. Somehow I'd managed to get honours in my final years. That was pretty surprising, but also despite that, I felt still really overwhelmed by the prospect of becoming an F1 doctor and having all this new responsibility. Sensibly, I'd applied to the Trent Deanery, which is the area around Nottingham, and that meant that I wasn't changing too many things all at once, wasn't having to move across the country and learn a new place. So here's a brief summary of the job process. So if you're a non-medic, listen up, but if you're a medic and know all this, then skip to this timestamp, I'll put it down below. In your final year of medical school, you will apply to an area, or what we call a deanery, and this is where you want to do your foundation jobs. You have to rank every single deanery in the whole country, so there's a lot of them, and obviously some are more popular than others, and these are more competitive. So the whole cohort of medical students in 1 year is then ranked from the best to the worst, and this is a score that's made up of your university degree, as well as other things like an exam called the SJT, a previous degree before, or anything else like publications. They then go down the list, starting with the best candidates and ending with the worst. And the idea is that the best candidates should get their first choice first. If you haven't performed great, literally you could end up anywhere in the country. And I know that's really daunting for a lot of students. So once you've got your deanery, you then have to do the very same thing, but for jobs. So as I mentioned, there's 6 jobs across the 2 years, and they'll be grouped as a 6. So you can only choose that combination of jobs. And again, depending on your rank, you'll get your first choice or not. Luckily for me, Nottingham or the Trent Deanery wasn't too competitive. So after I'd ranked those 200 jobs, I managed to get my first choice. I'll pop them on the screen, but essentially in F1 I was doing anaesthetics, upper GI surgery and stroke, and we're going to talk about that today. So I was doing all those jobs at the Royal Derby Hospital, and although I was really apprehensive, I was reassured because I knew the Derby Hospital fairly well. I'd been there in my 4th and 5th years, and I really liked the way the hospital ran and the culture within the hospital. I'd also spoke to people in the year above me, and the people that had stayed in Derby Hospital whilst I was a 5th year, they said it was a really good place to do F1. So that's a tip for medical students. If you know people in the year above, or you're on your placements, just chat to the doctors and figure out, is this a good place that I could be working as an F1? That is if you're going to stay in the area that you're studying. So at this point in my career, I thought I wanted to do anaesthetics. I knew that there were some really tough exams to do in your registrar years, but I saw at the end that consultants had a really good work-life balance, and their understanding of physiology and pharmacology was unbelievable. I also like the fact that you can only have 1 patient at a time in anaesthetics. An anaesthetist can only give 1 anaesthetic to 1 patient, whereas a medical registrar or medical consultant will be looking after a whole ward of patients, and I preferred that kind of risk. Although I wanted to do anaesthetics, this wasn't a true anaesthetic job. As an F1, you can't just perform an anaesthetic. It takes years of training. So actually this was a high dependency unit job, and there were a group of junior doctors that were running this high dependency unit under the guidance of a consultant of the day. The patients that we had were both medical and surgical, and it was a really interesting cohort of patients. We took a lot of ITU step-down patients, a lot of people with something called pancreatitis, where they had lots of fluid management issues, and we also had patients that had high pain needs. So these may have been cancer patients, these may have been patients with multiple rib fractures that required an epidural. So I had exposure to a very specific group of patients quite a lot, but actually they fundamentally taught me some very good basics about things like pain, fluid management, and what a sick patient looks like. So in hindsight, this was actually a really good job to start on. I didn't have any on-calls, and every single day I had plenty of time to see 1 or 2 patients before the ward round, and then there was a consultant ward round where I'd present my patient. This meant I was getting really good direct feedback from a consultant every single day, and I was really learning how to assess a patient. I would say this was a very atypical F1 or SHO job. A lot of the foundation jobs are normally very admin heavy. There's lots of patients to see. You see a patient in a very short amount of time, and you're always pressed for time with lots of sort of paperwork and discharge letters. And I didn't quite realise that at the time, and I found that out in my future jobs, but it was a great job to start on. Anyway, so overall, rate that job probably an 8 out of 10. It was really good learning experience, had a great time as well. So after my anaesthetic job, I was then rotated onto a general surgical job, and that was specifically an upper GI surgery job. Before anyone gets excited, I only spent 1 day in theatre in the whole 4 months. So as soon as anyone mentions surgery, everyone thinks, oh, I'll be scrubbing in and I'll be assisting. And I only did that once. The whole time I was just doing ward rounds, just doing admin, just doing ward jobs. I was really busy, leaving late. It was actually not a very good job at all. It was a really tough job, in contrast to the HDU where we were really well staffed and I had loads of time to assess a couple of patients and then discuss. This was about getting through the ward round as quickly as possible, trying to see all the patients, and then the consultants and registrars can go to theatre and we can do the ward jobs. We had much less structure, so the day started earlier in general, but different surgeons wanted to do different things, different ways. And I understand that a bit more now, but I remember at the time, I didn't understand why surgeons wouldn't see other surgeons' patients, whereas that's a bit more acceptable in medicine. But essentially the juniors were looking after all the patients. So you may have 3 surgeons that had patients on the ward. You may end up doing 3 separate ward rounds in the morning. It just meant there was a lack of structure with that. I would say this is probably a more typical experience of an F1 job, and whether it's medicine or surgery or another specialty, often you will have lots of admin to do, lots of work, and essentially you've got to figure out what is the next job that needs to be done now, which patients are sick, what do they need doing, and very quickly you understand how to prioritize those jobs. So overall, I'd probably rate that job maybe a 3 or 4 out of 10. Didn't really enjoy it. Didn't massively have a great rapport with the seniors and often found myself a bit stuck. I think it's kind of the way it goes in surgery. The surgeons, they have to do surgery, so they go down to theatre, and that can sometimes mean that there's a very junior team looking after the patients on the ward that are either awaiting surgery or have had surgery. And sometimes those patients are really sick. It's difficult to get a senior review or in contact with your team. So surgery is not for me, so I'm a bit biased, but yeah, 4 out of 10. So my next job was my final job in F1, and it was in the summer, and that was an acute stroke job. And I was really nervous about this job. I remember thinking stroke is very acute, people get very sick, and ultimately it meant that I had to confront a lot of sick patients all the time and probably have some difficult conversations. And I knew that going into it, and I was right in that respect, but I wasn't right to be so apprehensive. It was actually a really good job and a really positive experience. So stroke itself is when the blood supply to the brain becomes compromised. This may be because of a bleed into the brain, or it may be because of a clot in the blood vessels that are in the brain. And this leads to cell death ultimately at parts of the brain. Now, depending on which parts of the brain are affected, means you get different types of symptoms. And those symptoms normally are fairly debilitating and can be lifelong. There are some treatments that we can give in certain cases, but a lot of the management of stroke is actually after the injury. So we had a high dependency unit attached to the stroke unit, and then we had a very big stroke unit. The nurses were fantastic, really enjoyed working with them. The one thing I really enjoyed about stroke was the fact that there were so many different people. So each stroke patient will probably have a nurse, a doctor, a carer, and then they'll have a physio, an OT, a speech and language therapist, a nutritionist, and maybe a psychologist. Essentially, you have loads of different people from different teams giving a different opinion, and it leads to a really good holistic approach to stroke. So some of the patients, when they first come in, are extremely sick, and as a result, I was exposed to very difficult conversations. As an F1, I felt that I probably shouldn't be exposed to them, but actually looking back is part of the job, and you won't feel qualified when you're first having those conversations or involved in them. You get that student feeling again, like, oh, is it appropriate that I'm here? But it is, you're the doctor, so you're learning and you know the patient, you know the family, so it's absolutely appropriate for you to put yourself in those positions. Obviously they can be difficult, so I wouldn't do it all at once, but take guidance from your consultants, find consultants that you like and that you have a rapport with, and then ask them, can I join you for this conversation? And I think that's a really good way of starting to learn how to have those difficult conversations. Those conversations were often around prognosis, which with stroke is quite difficult to understand. The problem with stroke is that you do a CT scan normally, sometimes an MRI, and you look at the actual anatomy of the brain and see where the clots or the damage is in the brain. Those scans, They can look absolutely dreadful and the patient can have very mild symptoms, or they can look absolutely fine and have very debilitating symptoms. So it's really difficult. It doesn't really correlate the radiology with the symptoms. The other thing that's really difficult about stroke for families is that it's so sudden. So a stroke happens in seconds, and actually the consequences of a stroke are lifelong and can be very debilitating. You're having to deal with that and speak to the family in that time is obviously really difficult, and it requires a really skilled and empathetic approach from the clinician. And I'm really pleased that I got this job, because actually I saw some of the most unbelievable communication and medicine, to be honest, from some of my consultant colleagues. It was unbelievable how empathetic, how skilled they were with their language, and they were just excellent. And I learned so much from how to do medicine and how to be there for your patients, be an advocate for your patients, be realistic, be honest with families. And yeah, I had some really good mentors and really enjoyed the whole role. So I really enjoyed that job. And I remember, sometimes coming home and just feeling really privileged that I'd experienced a couple of, moments in the day, some conversations or some interactions with patients that were really just very human, or they were just very human, holistic encounters that I really enjoyed. Sometimes in medicine, you don't have enough time or space or headspace to see those moments. It's kind of difficult to see the wood from the trees, but I don't know, in that job, it was very obvious. So rating that job, probably 9 out of 10. It was brilliant. Consultants were a good laugh as well, and nurses were great. Have very few complaints. In general, I had a very good broad base in my F1 years, and I think that put me in good stead for my future, going into F2. And I think the biggest thing that I learned was what a sick patient looks like and what to do when you have a sick patient. My biggest concern as an F1 was that I'd either miss a sick patient, or I would be escalating a patient that actually wasn't that sick. I'd always get worried about calling the registrar. Is my patient sick enough? Is this a problem I should be dealing with on my own? It doesn't matter. If I was doing F1 now, the thing I would encourage is that if you have any concerns about anyone, you just escalate them. I'd empower F1s to seek help if they feel that they've got a patient that is out of their remit. And the last thing that I learned was how to prioritize workload. If you're in F1, see the sick patients and then worry about the admin. I hope that was insightful, getting a bit nostalgic, going back in time. It was now 4 or 5 years ago. My next video will be talking about my F2, and I was doing pediatrics, geriatrics, and public health. So again, very different. So subscribe to make sure you don't miss that video. Do me a massive favor, hit the like button. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.